All right. Well, I think I will begin because we have a very full hour scheduled here for everyone, or a little bit more than an hour. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Professor Cindy Buckley-Corin, and I serve as the committee chair for the Easton Pribble Visiting Artist Lecture Series. And this lecture series is made possible by a bequest from the estate of Easton Pribble, a longtime School of Art faculty member. So our mission is to bring a group of successful artists and designers who represent a variety of creative disciplines and bring a diversity of perspectives to inspire, motivate, and challenge the students of Pratt MWP. Our lecture series committee is dedicated to constantly reevaluating the breadth of artists and designers we invite each year, so that we may amplify voices and illuminate career pathways historically and presently marginalized within the art and design worlds. So by inviting leaders in their field to speak about their current work and creative thought process, our speakers participate in a dialogue with the Pratt MWP community that enriches the experiences of freshmen and sophomore BFA students here during their time in Utica before they complete their education at Pratt Institute's Brooklyn campus. All of our talks are always free and open to the public, and we're currently finalizing the details of our 2021 season, so please be on the lookout for invitations in the fall. And now I'd like to hand over the spotlight to Kim Carr. She serves on our faculty here at Pratt MWP, and she has a special connection to today's guest. So welcome, Kim.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited to introduce my dear friend, Richard Friedberg, today. Many years ago, back in the late 90s, I worked for Richard as his studio assistant. Keep in mind, it was a different era. At first, Richard was a little apprehensive to hire a woman to create his monumental aluminum sculptures. With some encouragement from my sculpture professor, Terry Slade, Richard interviewed me. At the interview, I remember he had me assemble a steel shelving unit to see what type of mechanical reasoning I had. And he talked to me the entire time. And I successfully assembled it and I got the job. Now Richard often hires female assistants. I worked for him for 3 years, the summer between my junior and senior years at Hartwick College, and then 2 years after my graduation, including spending 1 year living with Richard, his wife Liz, and their family in Soho. The rest of the time was spent working at his beautiful upstate estate near Oneonta, where the scale of the landscape and the studio itself influenced the work created there. On the top of the hill in rural Delaware County, the sky is large and looming, and when a storm comes, the clouds can be quite dramatic, as Richard's work also can be. This opportunity was pivotal in the direction of my own life and career and opened my eyes to the very large and the very small art world. I am forever in Richard and Liz's debt, and I attempt to pay it forward with every single student I teach. One doesn't create work like Richard's without an assistant or two. At that time, the type of metalwork he was doing can be very hard on the hands and the body, and it needs to be delegated to assistants if a sculptor has the desire to create for a lifetime, which fortunately for all of us, Richard has been able to do. I suspect working with so much screening now has its own special pains. Richard will show you some images of pieces we worked on during that time, one of which was Diva, which is exhibited right at the Munson Williams Proctor Art Institute, celebrating the 20th anniversary of Sculpture Space, in which he was one of the founders. His methods and motivations were rather formal, never minimalist, as it was extremely Baroque. There was always a structural order, but also such chaos. To say it was labor intensive is an understatement. Hundreds of shapes had to be made out of aluminum. First, we would rough cut the shapes out of 1/8-inch aluminum sheet with a plasma cutter, surface the metal with a grinder, trim each shape with a bandsaw, route each shape using a jig, and then file the edges smooth. I'm a stickler for line quality and edge control to this day because of that. All that labor was just to get the inventory of shapes to work with. After, they would be rolled into curves, welded together, ground again, and often bolted into place, so they could later be disassembled from the main body of the sculpture. That's something I know Richard will speak about, disassembly of work to get it through doorways. That's an important aspect of monumental sculpture. Each day, we would start with a rather clean studio, and at the end of every day, I would be cleaning up, sweeping, and organizing for the next day. That is an important part of your studio practice for the students to consider, cleanup time. In the past, Richard was a professor both at CalArts and Farley University in New Jersey. Although he had left the field, he was the consummate teacher, and in some ways my assistantship was more of an apprenticeship. He would often tell stories of his time at Yale and his very well-known artists who were his contemporaries, his early days in New York, his travels, and settling in Soho, when Soho was not necessarily a place one would want to be unless you were an artist. His passion and dedication to the practice were instilled in me. He would often ask my opinion on where his composition was going. When I first started working for him, I had no idea how he could envision something so complex. And only with time did I come to that understanding. Looking is not just a passive exercise, it's vital. At that time, he would create a model, at times out of metal or chipboard, often in a smaller Soho studio. We would work from the model, but it was not the end of the creative process for him. Always looking, always questioning, translating from the miniature to the monumental has its challenges. These include real structural challenges, issues concerning gravity, and balancing the visual weight of mass. During this time, my father helped Richard procure a forklift that could reach up to 22 feet in the air. I would get lifted to the top of the sculpture, weld or screw aluminum components in place while Richard stood comfortably on the earth, much of the time composing on the large scale, ensuring the piece was correct. If it wasn't just right, it would be cut apart and repositioned, and he so enjoyed getting up there on that magical piece of equipment. He would combine the aluminum with folded felting that was often impregnated with resin that harkens back to the folds of Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. That book was ever present in the studio while Richard worked on his operatic constructions of that time. One can see the evolution of the process through Richard's work, and then at its most evolved in the Terrible Beauty exhibition currently here on display. What I see in the process that has evolved, it is a process that has evolved to meet the narrative. In some ways, the component became the focus, freed from its structural confines. Not only is Richard a founding member of Sculpture Space here in Utica, he has also exhibited widely throughout the course of his career. His work has been featured at the Whitney Museum of Art, Storm King Art Center, the O.K. Harris Gallery, Broadway Windows, and more recently has been featured at several of our local regional colleges and universities, including Hartwick College, my alma mater, and Hamilton College in Clinton. His work is also in the collections of Citicorp, Chase Manhattan Bank, Prudential Insurance, and many others, and raised to build in his commissions. That information is included in that catalog. There's much more I could say about Richard's work, but I'm going to let him tell you. He plans to speak for about 45 minutes. We're going to be having a question and answer after that. So you can post your questions on the Q&A that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom webinar throughout the course of the lecture, and then we will go over them afterwards. All right, and I will hand it over to Richard. And we'd clap now if we were in real space.
Well, thank you very much, Kim. That was a wonderful introduction. You were also just a terrific assistant, so I'm very pleased to be introduced by you. I'm happy to be talking with the students from Pratt today, and I've been thinking about what I might want to talk about. I thought that I would tell you something about how I came to understand what I wanted to do and the different steps that I took in moving my work forward. Everybody who works with physical materials really understands that everything actually starts with the materials themselves. They have a character, they're part of the natural world, and they have opportunities and limitations. And for me as a sculptor, my juices only get flowing when I am actually engaged with materials. You could almost say that one's imagination is transformed by the possibilities in materials, and that the person using those materials has to seize the opportunities that are offered. This is really the history of objects, the history of tools, the history of making things. So as a sculptor, you are automatically and certainly always contemplating how things work. What is their nature? What can I do with them? And as one starts to manipulate them, images come to mind, and there are possibilities show themselves. The nature of materials is so essential. It's the language that one develops comes from the manipulation of materials. Some materials have tremendous limitations. Some materials have great opportunities in them. Finding the right materials for one's imagination is a part of the process. And I am going to be showing you some things that start with lots of mix of materials. But before I do that, I wanted to tell you that the other kinds of thoughts that I have related to this has to do with the nature of space. For most people, space is defined by what surrounds it. So if you put your hands up, you got space in between. If you put your hands further apart, you have more space or less space. This common notion of space was always unfulfilling to me because it didn't really match up with my understanding of the natural world, of molecules and other physical properties in weather and transformations of the natural world. So I came up with an idea of space, and I thought a more accurate description of space would be, it is something that is defined by infinite expandability and infinite divisibility. So that space is really a continuum in which objects and forms and materials transform depending on the forces upon them, and that if one can put oneself in harmony with that notion, that one can move one's work forward. With that in mind, I am going to move forward to show you sculptures that I have made, and I have grouped them according to ideas that I use to move them forward. And I hope you'll see what I mean. Of course, I've had a long career. I've made sculpture for over 50 years. It was very hard to know where to start this talk to show you what I do. So I chose to show work starting with that which was made from mixed materials. So with that, I'm going to show you the first piece that I did in the early 70s. This is a piece called Mombacus, and it was shown at the Fischbach Gallery. And as you can see, it's made up of wood, aluminum screening, epoxy, and glass wool. I envisioned this piece as a kind of place as opposed as a kind of thing. And it was mostly conceived as an ever expanding space above the clouds, with this slab, this laminated slab, almost looking like a bowling alley. It's about 20 feet long, hovering in space, below which is made out of glass wool, and above is made of harder materials. My idea here was that if I could pick different points in the continuum of space between the physically dense and the physically translucent and the physically spindled glass that was on the ground, I would be showing the range of expansion and compression that was informing my understanding of space. I'm going to show you another view of it. Because of the time we have to discuss these things, I will move through some of the other views of it fairly quickly. So I hope that will be okay with you. But if I were looking at this from the other end of the space, you would see all the same elements, but seemingly organized in a very different way. From this view, you can also see shards of what should be concrete underneath. And you also see linear elements that are stretched between some of the spaces. The chore here was to make these things in such a way as they all seemed that they were suspended in space and moving through each other, not still. They were a place and they were moving through to another space. And this was a moment in time where all these things are held in some kind of equilibrium. Now I'm going to show you another piece that I showed at the Whitney Annual in the early 70s, and it has a lot of the same kind of thinking within it. It's made out of aluminum, which was a space frame that I made in a factory in Brooklyn. It has a plane of rope that's tied into a grid and stretched between points in the of the tetrahedral spaces and plunging through the glass wool that you see below. The glass wool, just parenthetically, is a material they use in fish tanks. So when I bought this glass wool to make sculpture, they thought I was buying a tremendous amount. So I'll show you perhaps another view of this if I have it. I do not. So I'm going to move on to another piece, which has a lot of the same kinds of attitudes in it. You can see all the same kind of materials. In this piece, it was made in California at the California Institute of Art, or called Cal Arts for short. And this was in their library. They were going to renovate their library. I needed a space to work. They said, come on into the library and do what you want. And this is what I did. Outside the walls of the library, you can see those Venetian blinds on the left, and in the center of the lower picture was a sidewalk. And part of the renovation involved chopping up the sidewalk. When I saw that, I thought I could seize that opportunity, and I have them in wheelbarrows, just dump it in the middle of the library, where I arrange them into what you see here. This piece, it has grids in them. It has hard pointed geometric space. It has a explosive quality in the red linear elements that climb into space. And of course, it has the screening, which I was starting to use in a more dynamic way. Of course, in the recent piece that the Munson Williams is showing, it's all made out of the same material. So I have a long association with it. Moving on to the next piece. This was a piece I also showed at the Fishback Gallery. You're looking at my loft, or space in my loft on Green Street in what is now called Soho. It was a fairly rough space, but a terrific space to be able to make sculpture in. And this piece was made in a niche. So it is a shallow three surfaced box into which I put forms that were made of wood, polyester resin. That green shape that's folded around was made out of resin. And once again, I used the rubble. This rubble came from 95th Street. Once I got the idea to use rubble, I just kept searching for construction sites, and everybody was more than glad to give me their refuse. So this is another piece. It has a couple of views that I could show you. So it looks very different from one side to the next. It is environmental in its cast, it stretches into space. I talked earlier about how to extend materials. Extension in space has been key for me of how to get things to move out and move through each other. I've always enjoyed weaving forms together, taking one kind of material, pushing it through another, forming tight shapes and then loose shapes, and shapes that seem to almost evaporate, as in the sand leading to the wood floor. Okay, so I'm now going to move to a new group of work that I'm calling black and white. Some of it was all black, some of it was black and white, some of it had silver in it, but it was a real change in material for me. As I developed, I started to want to do things that stretched in space more and that were more open and see-through. So these were a couple of pieces that I started with in the 70s. This is called Harpersfield, named after the town that I lived in. And you can see that rather than being made out of lots of different kinds of materials, this is made all out of blackened steel. And the notion here was to create a place, a piazza, a place to be, not a thing in space so much as forms, once again, moving through space. The idea for the tetrahedrons, which you see used in this piece, and you can see more particularly in the lower right-hand section, came out of a very curious session that I had with my students in college, which was that I was teaching a form in three-dimensional geometry, and I was teaching them about tetrahedrons and alternatives of geometric form, how to make them, how to make them more complex as they grew into more complicated geometric forms. And I had a session where the students working with wooden dowels and glue guns, thank God for glue guns, were putting these things together. And about 20 of these students brought these things into one small studio and filled the studio with this generous amount of geometric form. And to me, it looked like air. It looked amorphous. It looked like it was ever changing. And that gave me the idea to use the steel and the tetrahedrons in this particular way. The idea was to use the structural nature of steel and the compounding, the compounding strength of the tetrahedrons to really float the sculpture. I didn't want the sculpture to sit on the ground so much as I wanted the sculpture to be totally fluid in space. This allowed me to make pieces that were could be outside, could stand in the weather, and it gave me a lot of opportunities that the earlier work, when I was mixing these ephemeral materials, didn't provide me. I'm going to show you another piece now, which is a piece I made and is owned by Storm King Art Center. And as you can see, it has some of the same elements, architectural elements, physical elements, and these curved elements. I was thinking of straight versus curved, soft versus hard. And I started bending these plates of steel at the Utica Steam Engine and Boiler Works sculpture space. So this is actually the first piece that I made at Sculpture Space. And I was really able to use large metal forming equipment and welders and gantries and hoists to make this piece. And it was really a wonderful opportunity. I was not highly experienced with steel, but the workmen and work people at the Sculpture Space were really marvelous in teaching me how to use the equipment and get out of it what I wanted. I'm going to look at some other pieces with you of this period. This is different in a bunch of ways. It's certainly more formal. It is a wall piece. And I found from doing this piece that working on the wall was a wonderful place to be, that you could have a space that didn't intrude too much into the physical space in galleries and homes, and that it allowed one almost a pictorial opportunity, that you could make something that extended in space from the wall, but at the same time had the formal characteristics that you might associate with painting. At the time I made this, I was learning to fly a plane. And this piece is called a Teterboro, and Teterboro is where I trained. And one of the things that I was really struck by as I was studying to fly was that as you got up into the air and as you were flying through space, that everything below looked dramatically different than it did when you were on terra firma. Looking down at forms, the forms would flatten, compress, systems of roads and natural mountains and rivers would all move and flow through each other in a way that was quite different than how one would experience them on the ground. One could make the comparison to being a scuba diver. That's another kind of space, not the aerial space of flying, but that close-hauled space of where your view is somewhat limited. The viscousness of the water around you changes the nature of forms as you perceive them. And so I was getting more and more interested in different kinds of spacing, different ways to extend. Steel, of course, is one of the most extendable materials. It's rigid. It's can take tremendous stresses as it's extended through space. And I found it liberating for me to make pieces in this way rather than propping up materials and stretching materials through each other. Now looking at another, I'm going to show you just two smaller pieces that I made of the same nature. I believe the left, the sculpture on my left, I gave to my wife's baby doctor for the birth of my daughter. So that has particular resonance for me. And I started using the screening as a way of filling planes that you could then look through. So you had this filtration of the wall, the grids, the smaller scale grids of the screening, and the geometry of things sort of flipping through space. At this point, I decided I wanted to do something somewhat different. I'm always in these groupings trying to express that as I work on these different ideas, I do them in groups. so that I do one, then I do another. And before I know it, I have many. And at some point I say, well, I need to put something in, or I need to put something out. I need to move my work off center and move it in some direction. And so arbitrarily, I would do different things. And here I started to paint on these kinds of wall structures. And I'm just showing you sort of a transitional piece here, which is has all the same kinds of elements in it, but now I'm starting to use color, and they're becoming brighter and less graphic in their nature because of the multiplicity of colors. And I'm starting to make distinctions between different characteristics in the piece where I want to emphasize a T or a corner of a box or a tetrahedron, so that I can show the elements, I can separate the elements by color and still have this cohesive space where things are moving forward and back and flowing along. This was a fairly timid attempt at the time. It was really just moving a little bit forward, and then I continue to move in this direction. So we're now moving on to this next group that is fully in color. Everything is considered as both form, color, and space. I'm now weaving together folded forms against these structural corners and T's, and these tetrahedral-like structures that can float out in space. Although this is against the wall, it actually stands out quite a bit in space, and I can show you this. Oh, I thought I could show you this in another view, but I didn't put it in. Here's another work. A lot of the same ideas are in it, and you can see the color is developing. You can change the emphasis, you can give poignancy to a detail by color, and you can still use it as a kind of mapping tool to lead the eye to different characteristics of the piece as they develop. I'm going to move on, and here are two more pieces. I probably have less to say about these. I put them next to each other, partially because they're so much alike. They're different pieces, but they have some of the same spirit in them, of the folded form, the open grids. Now starting to put screening in them to get softer forms. I've put different kinds of screening, some of them, excuse me, some of them fairly rigid mesh forms, and then some rather soft and easy to manipulate forms that I sewed through the other forms that you see. I say they're alike only because the basic sense of them, the way they curve from left to right, the way they open up one way and close up in the other, was what I was intending for both of them. I could also mention that I often work in pairs, so that I'll work a piece by itself for a while, then I'll get bored with it, I'll move on to something else, and then I see what I can do in the first piece, and back and forth. So they tend to cross-fertilize with each other as I'm making them. And this gives you the idea that similar forms can move in very different directions, and you can suss out the opportunities and pursue them all. This is another one of my favorites. This was owned for a period of time by the Grand Gun Foundation and shown at the Boston Museum. But I always like this piece in particular just because of the balance between the soft cloud-like forms and these hard T's and the jumble of linear elements flowing through it. And sometimes it comes through in a particularly comely way. And this is one that I thought was quite successful. Another piece of mine is called Queen of Hearts. This was on the cover of my show at the Millikan Gallery in Soho in early 1980, I believe. And it's just another example of moving my sculpture forward, trying to push the limits of color and the rest. Okay. I'm going to move on now to a different group that during this time I started gaining some traction in the art community, and I started to be offered opportunities to do larger works in different buildings and around different buildings. And I did a group of them. Some of them were difficult to accomplish for a variety of reasons, but they were really a different kind of scale for the work and offered me a grander opportunity. This is a piece called Rio, and it was made for the international headquarters of Mobil Oil. And if we can appreciate the environment that it is in, it was in a round cylindrical space with walls inside it that led to elevators. Behind this wall and to the left are where you would enter the elevator banks, and to the right of it, you would enter the building if you were going on the ground floor. So I tried to make a piece that would change and open and closed as you moved around it. And this was about an 8 or 9 feet tall piece in a fairly contained space. I was very happy with it. I thought the color was quite buoyant and decorative and friendly. And I thought that the forms and shapes marched very nicely through the sculpture. Unfortunately, this sculpture was disassembled when the wife of the head of Mobil Oil International came to close to the piece to take a look at it and bumped her ankle and bruised her ankle on one of those green tetrahedral forms. And instantly it was disassembled. Luckily, later, several years later, it was put back together on a different floor in a different location near the employees' cafeteria, and it was pretty successful there as well. I'm going to move on and show you another commission. And this was a wall sculpture that's about 18 feet from bottom to top. And it's situated in Buffalo in their what was then a new underground rail system, subway system. And I was given the opportunity to make a piece that on the wall under which an escalator would take the passengers down to the train level. So it was a piece that you would see at first from ground level, and you would mostly see the top half of the piece with the green and the red and the white. And then as you move down the escalator, the rest of the piece would reveal itself to you. There are windows to the left and a wall to the right. So it was quite a nice opportunity. You could also see this piece from outside, and it was used on the cover of their brochure announcing the opening of the rail system. Unfortunately, this space was once again renovated, and the piece was taken down and put into storage and has not been put up again. When working in public spaces, one is always up against the nature of the space, the nature of the people that own the spaces and use the spaces, and often their life is limited by the changing needs of the people who use the space. That, to me, became problematic over time. I'd rather make pieces that didn't constantly get removed. And I made commissions for a period, and then I actually stopped. But I did do one final big commission for a building in Jacksonville, Florida, which is the South Central headquarters for Prudential Insurance. And they had a history of being supportive of the arts. And they asked to make this hanging sculpture for their ground floor vestibule and escalators. It was a very interesting proposition because people came in from many different directions. They moved up the escalators. They came in from parking lots that were up on mezzanine floors. So there was an opportunity to make a rather meandering piece of soft and hard forms that could stretch through a large space with columns. It was about 2,500 square feet, and is actually very, very difficult to photograph. I had the idea at one point that this piece should meander through the lobby and push through a window and out onto what's now called River Walk, which was an open ambulatory space outside the building. But the architect didn't think that was such a great idea. I'm just showing two views of this that you can see how dramatically looking they can be depending on viewpoint. And this is the best I could do in photography. Okay, I'm now moving on to another group of work. At this point, I said I needed a change. I was making all these big polychrome structures, and I was trying to make the forms that were curvilinear against very hard and rigid forms. And I thought, well, maybe I should start to thicken these forms. So I took a period of time, and I took some of the vocabulary of shapes that I had been working with, these flat curved shapes, and I started building wax on them and thickening them into more organic shapes. And this is what I came up doing. Now you can see this appears to be very different from what went before, but they were really built on some of the same ideas and some of the shapings that I was using in the earlier pieces. You will also notice I took all the geometry out. I took bright color out. I took rigidity out of it and made a series of forms that I could use again and again in different sculptures. So if you look here, you're seeing these organic forms that are cast in aluminum and painted, that are then welded together. And you can see if that there are different individual forms that you will see in different sculptures as we move forward. I, in fact, developed a specific vocabulary of forms that about 40 shapes. I had them sitting at a foundry up in the North Country of New York State. And I'd say to the guy every once in a while, I need 5 of this kind of form, and I need 3 of these. And I would make these aluminum forms in order to move the ideas forward and to make different opportunities. If you look at other pieces, you'll see some of the same forms in them, but they are now configured in a very, very different way. One is the one on the left is freestanding. The one on the right is a wall piece. And this has a rather curious element in it, which you'll see in the center, which are cantaloupes. And the way that developed was that my sister had come to visit me, and we were sitting there one morning eating our morning cantaloupes. And my sister started asking me, what would you do if you were going to cast these? So she and I went out to my studio, and we made molds and came up with sections of cantaloupes that I then welded together into forms to make several sculptures. So that's just an interesting tidbit. Once again, you see some of the same forms, but creating a very different imagery. See, we're getting close to the time that I would like to open it to questions. So I'm going to move through some of this rather quickly. These are other forms. Of course, what you can see here is I decided to paint them very differently. Rather than applying color in veils of color, one over the other, I decided to work with an oil stick. And some of these wall sculptures were done in this manner. I didn't do too many of these. I did maybe 3 or 4, and then I moved on to something else. And I want to highlight this particular sculpture because you're going to see it again in another piece. And why I'm showing this to you is to show you that you can clone pieces. You can take a piece and you can say, well, I want to move in this direction, or I could move in another direction. And I start to say, well, why don't I move in both directions and see what happens? So this was a piece that I had made. I did another version of this that was also on the wall. But then I moved forward doing another group. You're going to have to wait to see the what I was talking about just a second ago, but you'll see what I mean when I get to it. I then decided to do another group of sculptures that I made all out of similar copper shapes. I had the shapes made. I had hundreds of them that I could put together, the different groupings. I started to use polyester and epoxy resins to make these organic shapes that you see in yellow here. I started to use the aluminum screening as well in this piece, and wood. And it's all soldered together. This is about 3 feet across. And I made a whole bunch of these. I had never showed them until a year or 2 ago when I showed them in Franklin, New York as a coherent group. But I made about 15 or 20 of these before I moved on to something else. What I'm continually trying to tell you is you can work in groups, you can exhaust certain ideas and then push them into another arena and forcing other elements into them so that you can continue to grow and imagine as a sculptor. Here is another one. Of course, this one has copper, aluminum, brass and epoxy in it. On the wall, this is really quite small, probably a foot and a half across, rather jewel-like. And another. This is aluminum, brass, and copper, and epoxy. Looks quite different from the early mixed media pieces I was doing. And another. Now, I wanted to show you a group of models that I have done. One of the questions that always comes up is, how can you work on these big pieces without doing a model first? And I have always used models as a working method, is to work out some ideas, sometimes primitively and sometimes in detail. But it's when you get to actually building from these models that the real work begins. But this group is a group of models that I made that were very complex, that I've never built large, or most of them I did never built large. So here is one of them. It's about 3 feet across in every direction, and has a lot of the elements that you now will recognize in my work, so I won't belabor the points. And in this piece, I was trying to make something that if you looked at it from one direction, you looked at something that was dramatically different from looking at it in the other direction. You know, in traditional sculpture, where you had bronze, wood, or stone materials involved, often the sculptor was trying to make objects that in fact were manipulations of the surface, so that as you moved around it, the continuity of surfaces would reveal a continuous form that you could understand front to back and felt completely whole, and that the elements within the skin, the muscles and bone, would be shown through the manipulations of topography. This is a very different idea, where you're making something that's flailing out into space and is in constant transformation. And so I thought, well, it could transform so dramatically that the other side would be dramatically different. Here's what I'm talking about. This is the same piece, looking at it from 180 degrees, different direction, and feels a little bit like a stage set or a proscenium where something could be going on. Still place, still using all the forms, still weaving everything together, but getting more and more complex, more and more ornate, if you like, and becoming more dramatic in form. These are 2 other pieces. And just to show you that, the one on the right I did make larger. So I will be showing you a larger version of that. But these had a lot of the same qualities that I've been describing. They're all made out of paper, toothpicks, wood, cloth rags, and anything else that I could find. I probably should mention a little bit something about Bernini. Through all this, I've had a group of artists that I've been looking at and loved, and at some point I became very engaged with looking at Bernini's sculpture. Bernini was an artist who was a counter-Reformation artist, did most of his work in Rome, and was active during the Counter-Reformation from about 1600 to 1680. So that's his lifespan. And of course, what was characteristic of this Baroque work that he became known for was its drama, its ecstatic emotion, and its ability to extend into space. So I was very, very attracted to it, and I made several pieces that referenced it. This sculpture on the right relates a little bit to what Bernini did in the church in Rome in, I'm blocking the name, I can't believe it, but in St. Peter's. Okay, so now I'm showing you another model. I'm going to show you a larger version of this piece, and you can see in this model, which was first made in paper, and then with paper and wood and material, and then was later made at the same scale into aluminum with epoxy. And as you can see here, one side is very different from the other. This is a piece called Diva, and I was attempting to make one form sort of enclosed and embracing, and the other form to be assertive and outward thrusting. And I did do that in a larger fashion, and I did them outdoors. So here now you're looking at Diva as I described it, from being in its Devo formations, in its Devo aspect of shouting out in a celebrative, in a fanfare kind of way. And then the other side of it is more curved, internal, softer, more comforting. Notice that you can look completely through the pieces. They're completely open. There's no hidden structure. And that's what I was trying to do. This is about a 10-foot high piece, a 10-foot by 10-foot piece, and was in fact shown at the Munson Williams many, many years ago, maybe 20 some years ago. Here's a piece. You saw the earlier model, and this is made out of felt impregnated with epoxy and aluminum. It had 4 quadrants to it. I'm not going to show you all 4 because of time, but if you move to the left or to the right, you would have seen another vignette that was created that would be quite different from this, and around to the back and around again. So there were 4 distinct little dioramas, if you like, or distinct little events that happened that were unique to it, but also participated as making something of a whole. Okay, this is a big piece I did called Eroica. And at this point, I've said so much about what I think about that I don't really need to describe it, except that I wanted to tell you that this started in a very unusual way, because it started from the very center of this piece, where you see these organic forms, very much like the ones that I was showing you earlier. This one, I showed you a version of that center in oil stick, and it was one of the ones I decided to clone in a very different direction. And so I show you the center of this piece, and I show you the piece I showed you earlier, which shows the same forms, or a lot of the same forms. But at this point, I'm rather making a small wall piece. I took the elements, I put a wall behind it in the form of a big circle. I prop it up on a pair of tall horses, and I developed underneath it some architectural elements, and I moved upward and out using these roofing copper materials that I found in junkyards to make this softer element. I should just note parenthetically that this is a piece that Kim knows very, very well. And if you look at the very bottom, I can remember her sitting there and grinding with small burrs and tools to make all these forms that I had welded together into clean rock-like elements. So I'm sure she remembers that, and I sure remember her good work on this project. This piece also was designed so that as you moved around it, it would change dramatically and become something quite different. And this is the backside of the same piece. When I had been working on it, I had been working pretty much on the side that I had showed you earlier. And I had just propped it up on things, and I put braces against it to keep it stable. And over time, I came to like those braces. And so I started to incorporate them into the sculpture. And from that, I made a different kind of architectural space in which I put these curvilinear leaf-like elements that for me were almost like making a grotto kind of shape and letting things move through space and yet creating this kind of intimate space. Once again, you can see completely through the sculpture front to back. There are no hidden armatures or anything other than the elements of the sculpture itself. I don't know if I mentioned the name of this. This was called Eroica. It was named after a piece by Beethoven of the, it was initially called Hero and was really done in honor of Napoleon. And at some point, Beethoven became disenchanted with Napoleon and renamed his work Eroica, which means hero. This is just another piece. I'm coming closer to the current work that I've been doing, which I will move through quite quickly, I hope. And this is called A Wing and a Prayer and was shown in New York at the OK Harris Gallery. I haven't shown the other sides of the piece, but it changes dramatically. And on the other side, it's mostly brass rather than mostly aluminum. So you get this dramatic change of material. Then I started to paint them again. You know, I had made a bunch of pieces that were all made out of natural materials and had natural color that I used to differentiate parts of each other. And then I started to want to color them again. This piece was based on the downing of the airplane that came down in the Hudson River. And I was so dramatically moved by the images of it that I decided I would use that as source material to make a piece of a complicated object basically coming apart in space. And I think you'll see what I mean as we take several shots looking around the piece. You can see here it's really almost a filigree, and you can see it emanates out of something sort of solid and architectural and dense, and yet it is moving and is coming apart. Can I just do that again? Here's another view of it that you can see, and I was very pleased with the color and how the color changed as you moved around it. Some places being almost completely blue and green, and other places being almost orange and red. So this piece led me to thinking about things coming apart in space and being vaporous in space. And then I moved on to the group that is in the show. I hope that many of you have seen the show. I know some of you are on campus and some of you are not. And but there have been some videos made of the pieces, and you can always look at my website which is listed under my name, and you can see some of the pieces that I did here. Whoops, I went ahead of myself. Around this time, I was casting about looking for a change again, wanting to move my work in a direction. I decided to take all the geometry out. Decided to take all the flat planes out. I decided to take all the curved planes out and deal completely with this amorphous, ethereal material that I could shape and sew and make into more diaphanous forms. This piece was stimulated by the fires in Montecito and the campfire in California, and the horrificness and the incredible beauty and lusciousness of the imagery that attended it. So it was something that was quite forceful and quite horrible at the same time. And I found that really quite appealing. Kim earlier said that I make these things in parts. This is a good example. This has 14 elements in it that are each distinct. They are made in groups, and then they are sewn together and then put into larger groups and then staged so that they can get out of my studio and into other spaces. And then there was a ledge incorporated on the backside of this piece, and more of these diaphanous forms were put above it. So that's what Kim was referring to a bit, and this is what you can see in this piece. This piece really started off this series. This is called Macondo. Macondo is the oil field in which the Blue Water Gulf Horizon was situated when it blew up. And I started looking at pictures of this event, and I was just blown away by the dramatic, forceful, exuberant horror. Exuberance and horror is hard to say together, but a quality of great lifting and movement and drama against this sea of turmoil. And it grew all the way up into the sky. Pictures that you would see of it were really magnificent. And this is another piece I did, which is called Explosion. It's in the show as well. And it's made in two halves to get into the gallery. This piece came about really because a friend of mine gave me a piece of steel that was coiled into a spiral that I thought would be great to use for one of the explosive elements. And so I started using it. Of course, in the end, I cut it out of the piece completely. These pieces do have armatures as opposed to the earlier ones, because the material itself is soft and flexible and needs some internal support to make it stand in space. This is another piece again that's in the show. The show, of course, is called Terrible Beauty. It refers to a line in a William Butler Yeats poem called Easter, which was written on the eve of the Irish Rebellion of 1916, in which he uses the term terrible beauty as a refrain or part of a refrain in trying to describe something that was both wondrous and ecstatic and at the same time really awful. And this is a piece that was developed from a photograph that I began using during this period, and was of an oil fire from Iraq. Fukushima happened during this period, and I was interested in waves and tragedy and grand forcefulness, extraordinary expansive power. I said that again. But this was made on armatures, and I developed the color from the inside out. I started with a frame, and then some screening, and then screening with color, and more, sewing them together over an armature until I got what I felt was an expression of the forcefulness that I was seeing in the waves that I was looking at on the internet. I'm going to move through these fairly quickly because I think I want to leave time for us to talk. And so I will just allude to them and let you see them in the museum if you can, and on my website if you can't. Now I'm going to finish with one piece one sculpture that is not in the piece. Whoops, I blew it. This is in this piece. This is called someone should tell me the name of the piece. It's fire towers or fire something. Anyway, these are two elements associated with each other, about 12 feet tall. This is what I thought I was going to lead you to, which is the last piece in my presentation. And this is, of course, a tornado. And it is about 20 feet tall. It's made in sections, all with screening. And it was so large, we couldn't get it into the museum. Now, you know, the museum is very large, but there is a scale in which even getting it into a space like that was difficult. So it was left out of the show, but it's a piece that is the most recent of the group of six, of nine that I showed in the show. And I'm very pleased with it. It's a wonderful piece. So with that, I would like to end my presentation and open it up to questions and answers, and hopefully someone's got something to ask me that I can answer. Hello, Kim.
All right. Hi. I'm supposed to verbalize all of the questions. So we've had a few come through. I tried to take note of about when they popped in. So there were a couple similar questions regarding what the scale was of some of your wall pieces prior to those commission pieces that were wall pieces. So the smaller ones, I know one of them you had in your loft, I think, actually, but I believe they're probably in this scale, but some scale questions regarding that.
Well, I could certainly, I could have mentioned something as I showed the different pieces, but those pieces that were on the wall, especially ones that were high polychrome, are about 8 or 9 feet across the wall, maybe 6 feet tall, 5 to 6 feet tall, and they stick out from the wall about 30 inches.
Okay. Hopefully that answered that person's questions. I also had a question regarding how you chose the colors that you paint on your sculptures. That was a little earlier on the wall pieces as well, I believe, mostly. But I mean, of course, it could cover your whole history.
Well, color, of course, is one of the more difficult things to describe when talking about my sculpture, because color, of course, at its core has an emotional impact, and you paint the same thing in a different color scheme, you get a very different emotional tone to it. So I was choosing my colors for their emotional impact, but more basically, I was choosing two color in order to call out different emotions or themes that were within the work, whether it's something that was being dragged through another form or two forms that were separated in space that were supposed to cohere visually or perceptually. And so just as a mapping device of discriminating between the elements was part of it. And then this emotional tone. And most of these pieces that you saw of that period were kind of bright and friendly and outgoing and comely, rather than being dark or foreboding. So the emotional tone was what I was after, and this ability to discriminate within the elements.
Okay. I have a question from Janet Hill. Thank you for speaking to our students today. I wonder if you could expand on some of the behind the scenes managing aspects of making large scale sculptures. Are there tricks of the trade you've learned along the way you wish you had known earlier? Now, I also see there's another question that in regards to how you stick the elements together from Christy Woosen. I wonder if those could go together in some way in your answer. I would imagine, because I know there's definitely some learning within assembly.
Okay, let's see. The first part of the question had to do with...
You can look at these two on the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. But this one is, are there any tricks of the trade you learned along the way that you would wish you'd known earlier about making large scale sculpture?
Well, all the tricks of the trade you just develop as you do it. Of course, there's engineering involved. The nature materials, as I was describing at the beginning, some of them are rigid and can be cantilevered in space. You certainly don't want to try and do extensions in big extension of space out of clay, which has a limited ability to be extended, but steel, aluminum, those qualities are of an engineering nature and allows you to build lots of big spaces and keep it relatively light. I used models to deal with this. In other words, when I start something, I'm just starting to do something rather primitive. I'm gluing something together, I'm squeezing it, I'm moving in a direction. Then at some point, I start to have problems, engineering problems. It wants to fall over. It won't sustain itself. At that point, I start to work on a larger scale and start to figure out what I need to do to position it in space in a way that it can survive. And I'll work back and forth between the model and the finished work many times to develop an idea in one moment and to deal with structure and staging in another. All the pieces, certainly those that have a large scale, have to be made in parts. And you say, well, how do you stick them together? Well, you do it just like you stick anything together that you're taking elements and forcing it to meet. And so I would have plates, I drill holes, I have bolts, I tie things. So there are many ways that things can be kept stable and yet be able to take them apart so they can move out of the studio, down the road, into a museum or other location. So everything that is made, even the most colossal, is made in parts. And whether they're the pyramids or whether they are stone friezes on the Parthenon, they are all made in parts, and the sculptor's chore is how to bring them into proximity in a way that they are stable, can maintain and carry the ideas properly.
Good. I think this one's a good one. If I'm Johnson, I'm not sure who it is, but if you had a select single work that best captures your point of view as an artist over time, which one would you choose to show? And there's a supplemental question after that one.
Well, that's like asking which of your children do you love most. There are definitely some that are not my favorites, and sometimes there are a few that are particularly poignant for me that I've kept around a long time. Some of the ones that are the Queen of Hearts was one, Teterboro is one, Eroica is one, that large Macondo is one. When I was trying to decide what to show, I would look at something and say, well, I like that one, but I like the next one a little better. And then every time I tried to put something in, I put something else in as well, because in a sense, I love them all. And I do not abandon sculptures. I work them till they are done to my satisfaction. So I don't get to a place where I say, it's not any good, and I'm just going to leave it alone. I will put it aside for a while, but I always come back to them. I have pieces in my studio that started 20, 25 years ago that never gelled, but I am committed to completing them. So it's you forge them into being in some way over time.
Okay. I have a question from one of my students, Ethan. A sculpture student going into my third year at Pratt, what advice do you have? What should I focus on? Craft, concept, research? Advice
well, people work in very different ways. An idea is nothing without the materials, and the materials are nothing without an idea. So if you say, what should I focus on? Should I be focusing on craft or ideas or something technical? I say you focus on it all. And the main thing is to keep moving forward. This is the message of what I'm telling to you. You do something, and then you do something again. You do something else. You do something more. And as you do this, your imagination is engaged, and things happen. So what you need to do is not just to focus on craft or idea, but focus on the opportunity. And the opportunity is within the materials and in the actual manipulation of things. The nature of things is what it's all about. And ideas can be great, ideas can be terrible, and sculptures can have great ideas and still be terrible. So it's a fluid, organic thing that you do as you force your thinking processes forward. You're always born in your time. You're always subject to the forces that you see around you. The nature of nature seems to constantly change in its angles. Today, there are new technologies, new engineering, new electronics, new ways of making and forming things. They're very exciting, and they're all opportunities. An idea without form is not much of an idea.
Okay, that's a good answer. I'll have to quote that. Okay, so I have another comment. Thank you for speaking about your artistic influences. This isn't my student struggling to find. Well, speaking about your models, I was wondering if you can address how these reference your environmental influences, such as when you were inspired to use the rubble.
My environmental influence, I think I've been.
The rubble connected to the environment. I wonder if that was on your mind.
Well, I'm trying to understand the thrust of the question, but the sculpture is always about your environment. You are part of it. It is within you, and you are trying to manipulate it for some personal, perhaps private reasons. I do not make sculpture to make symbols of political ideas or social ideas, although I'm aware and I'm engaged in those ideas as a person in the world. But it's the interaction, the seeming transformation that takes place in mentation as you engage materials. The models, the rubble, all serve the same purpose of trying to understand something about the nature of things. And I don't know that I can say much more specifically about the environment. They are environments, they exist in environments, and they allude to things outside themselves.
Okay, and I have it looks like one more question, which will fill us our time, unless I'm missing something. I'm interested, this is from Jamie Grimes. I'm interested in the legs found at the base of several pieces. In Macondo, these lift the source of energy. In Areca, similar structures are lifted to create a stage-like space that invites the viewer. That's a very good observation. I saw many examples of this volume or defined area in many pieces. As you create a dialogue with your work over time, how do such features change and or remain the same? How do you refer to these specific structures, spaces? I call them legs, but they are clearly many things.
Well, of course, sculpture has to stand. It can stand vertically, it can float horizontally, it could exist in a whole, but it has to have a coherent element to it. Otherwise, it's just a phenomenon. You know, I could have lit gasoline to make explosions. I could have used TNT, but instead I wanted to make something that could stand still. You call them legs. Of course, some of it has to do with getting something to move up in space into a dynamic energy, and sometimes it has to do with referencing gravity and things that are harder to put vertically into space. But the example of Macondo is quite interesting to me because for those of you that have seen the show, Macondo there is slightly different than in the image that I showed you here, in that it has a circle that it floats on the floor. And that was a compromise that I made to be able to show it at the museum. Ideally, that would have been anchored to the floor of the museum if they had let me. I would have drilled holes and put in bolts, and the piece would have been cantilevered from the architecture. But because was not possible, I built a floor for it, in a sense, or the sea that it sits in, as a compromise to the necessities of the moment. I think it would have been even more successful if it did not have that floating circle below it, so that it would seem to really emanate out of the sea itself. I feel I haven't answered this question well, but I think that I don't understand it enough.
Okay, well, there's also, this is in the Q&A, so I think we may be able to access some of that after the talk too, if you want to look it over and type something back. Sure. I believe that's going to wrap it up, unless there's some other questions. Oh, Jamie says, I just wanted to hear him talk about it. So that's great. The only other question was where your piece that was about the Hudson crash was located. My theory is it's on your property.
That's right. A lot of these large pieces, unless they were commissioned, remain with me. Very, very hard to find homes for some of these things. So they become my personal museum. I
One
have
day.
other pieces that I have made, by the way, many other pieces. This is, I've shown you a selection, but there's one that's 30 feet across at a dome that sits on the top of my studio that's been sitting there for 20 years waiting for a home. So they're at my place and until they're somewhere else.
All right. Well, thank you, Richard. That was very, very informative for everybody. There's information in the chat regarding another talk you're going to do May 6th, I believe. And I think we can wrap it up, but I'm not sure how to stop.
Well, I'm just going to say goodbye, and I thank everybody for listening to me. I hope I've been able to tell you something that helps. And but beyond anything else, I hope you go see the show. Those of you that can should do it. It is quite different in the flesh than in looking through a viewfinder.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.